out of all the really good content creation already available to us in the powerlifting community, one thing I feel like that I don't see any coaches doing is honestly a big discussion on programming. I feel like a lot of them do touch on programming in some really unique or just more advanced concepts, but there's never been a big just video format of a big deep dive into actual just basic powerlifting programming. So with that, I'm going to start a series here talking about the most core and basic concepts of powerlifting programming and kind of working my way eventually into some more advanced ideas and really just kind of tying it all together. This with how much insane information there is on the internet and just in this industry in general, my goal is to kind of help a lot of the newer and more intermediate powerlifters really kind of sift through all of it and kind of narrow it down to what is a good program and maybe what's a not so good program. So with that being said, one of the biggest things that we need to talk about up front is that everything I am discussing here, its sole purpose is nothing but making sure that somebody is the best powerlifter possible. Not trying to be the most generally strong person possible, and there is a pretty fine distinction between that. Not saying that there's not benefits to being a generally strong person, but say there's going to be a point in the programming and there's going to be a point in our training where we start gearing towards, hey, we're trying to refine and increase the skill of being a better powerlifter over just trying to be generally strong. And while there might not always be distinctions between training for either thing, there will be a point where there is, and it's very important to make that distinction, as there is with any sport. So if we're trying to, squat, bench, and deadlift for like being a better football player or something like that, there will be a point where it is considerably different from trying to be a better powerlifter. And that is what will roll us into our first key concept, and honestly what is, in my opinion, the most important concept of programming for a competitive powerlifter, and that is the term of specificity. And honestly, you could even go on to say that this is the most important thing for any sport, but actually having the proper definition of specificity for your sport is very important to know. So what I mean by specificity is our training, when we actually train, is how similar is it to our actual competition day. So for competitive powerlifters, our competition day is 3 relatively max attempts at some sort of squat that's met to competition standards, some sort of bench press met to competition standards, and some sort of deadlift met to competition standards. And that's why it gets to be very crucial for athletes and coaches to be able to determine how specifically they need to train to that while still trying to appease the concept of fatigue. Because obviously trying to do 9 relatively max effort attempts is very exhausting. And it's not something we can go in and do every day, let alone every week. Just as you see in any other sport you played, like I played football. So obviously we'd have a game on Friday, we'd have maybe harder practice on Monday and Tuesday, then we'd start to do some sort of taper when it came to the difficulty of practice on Wednesday and Thursday. That way we weren't insanely beat up, but still there was never really that many often times we would do a full board practice of just tackling the crap out of each other and beating each other up. And that was so that we could, still get somewhat relative practice to the sport of football, but not have so much fatigue along with it. Same concept as it is in powerlifting. While we're still trying to obviously appease the idea of specificity and training as specific as possible so that we're getting the most specific adaptations to the sport and trying to get the most specific skills, we still have to find that balance of what is specific enough to drive more adaptations and drive more skills within powerlifting, but not so high of demand on our fatigue and to make us so we're not beat up all the time. And that is why I made this really nice little visual representation on the kind of curve or the ideas of what kind of a range we have when it comes to specificity. So obviously this is a specific chart based on our competition squat. So say at the very, very top, the pinnacle of the pyramid, the most specific thing we can do for our competition powerlifting squat is a max squat. And say this is geared towards somebody that is a low bar squatter. Next, we have something that's more along like a 3-rep max. So still insanely high intensity when it comes to like a rate of perceived exertion. So the level of exertion is very, very high. But we're still now doing 3 reps. So a little bit less specific, but has a pretty high regard of specificity still. Up next, we have just more lower effort or more higher reps low bar squats. So while we're still obviously appeasing the skill and increasing the skill of a low bar squat, our competition movement, it is now done to a less specific intensity. After that, we're kind of getting more into like machines, so like a hack squat or like a leg press, something that still is going to be multi-jointed. We're still, getting some knee flexion, some hip flexion, things that still relatively mimic the squat, but obviously going to be considerably different on how it's balanced and how the weight and the load is actually managed. Past that, now we're more to like some single jointed exercise, so something like a machine hamstring curl or like even like a leg extension for quads. Now we're only moving one joint, and it's going to be considerably different than an actual competition low bar squat, but still might have some merit in helping it, but would never be really a true replacement. And so even past that, if I had any more shades of blue, I would have made this little pyramid bigger. But something past that would be like, say, like cycling or like, long distance running. Things where we're obviously still challenging the legs in some regard, but going to be to an insanely different manner than our competition squat. And admittedly, there's still a lot of things that could be in place of other things here. So say when it comes to trying to find other variances that might still have a pretty darn high degree of specificity, but still might give us some other good kind of breaks when it comes to fatigue management in other ways. So say like, replacing lower or like higher rep, lower effort or higher rep low bar squats might be something along the lines of like, hey, high bar squats, or doing some like safety squat bar squats, something that might help pull off some fatigue from the shoulders from needing as much external rotation to get in position, but still replicate our competition squat in a really nice manner. So this is where, honestly, it just gets to be to where a coach or an athlete needs to have a rather skilled eye, or just being able to look at past data and past training cycles and past training weeks and sessions of learning what is best for each athlete. And that's why, honestly, when it comes to figuring out what is the best for each athlete and yourself, is going to be somewhat of trial and error. There's going to be things that you need to try and see how well it works and see what we get from it, see what kind of data is produced, and using that data to either replicate it and reproduce it if the results are really good, or making small adjustments based off of how it did go and seeing if there needs to be some sort of improvement. As well as there will always be times and places for an athlete, kind of in regard to when they are competing. So say obviously when it's getting closer to competition, there might be merit to increasing the level of specificity, even if that means there will be a little bit more fatigue, but as long as that only means for a short few weeks, just to make sure that whenever they are stepping on the platform, they will have the most refined skill possible to be able to perform a squat, bench, and deadlift to a competition standard for 3 max effort attempts. And here is a nice little representation of the actual fitness fatigue model. So whenever we actually have a training bout, so that where that little actual line intersects of the graph, that's going to be where an actual training session occurs. And looking at what happens that when it comes to our level of fitness, so I just refer to that as skill usually. So our skill at performing a squat, bench, or deadlift to some sort of regard. Then the green line is going to be our level of fatigue. And then the actual red is going to be basically what's produced from the two when it comes to our performance. So obviously there's going to be a level or a point to where the level of fatigue is going to mask how much fitness we have. So it's a matter of trying to find in time not only our meet day, but each training session based off this fitness fatigue model. All right, so for sake of discussing frequency and the actual level of fatigue that we can get from frequency, let's pretend that the athlete we're discussing already has their volume and their intensity relatively figured out to help also aid in load management. And that is something we'll actually discuss next video in relation to volume and intensity and fatigue. But let's say those are already figured out here. So that's where it gets to be a really big tool to use this fitness fatigue model to figure out the individual differences on how often somebody can train. So say like for me, I bench 2 days a week. That's really all I can handle. And it works out really nice that after my primary bench day, roughly 72 hours later, I have my secondary bench day. Then roughly 96 hours after that, I come back around to my primary day. So there's a bit more rest there going into my primary day. So it's kind of put up on a pedestal a bit more. That way I'm a little bit less exhausted. I don't really have as much fatigue being carried into it, but I still have a relatively large amount of skill. So that's where kind of focusing on that change in performance is really important to notate. So say for me, I get to where my secondary session is going to be basically while that changed performance has just come back up to baseline, if not a little bit higher. Then my primary day is going to be when that change in performance is at its peak, when that I'm going to perform the very best. But that's where I say, hey, it gets to be a fine line of if we make that session too soon, then we'll be overtraining, quote unquote, and we'll be having that next session occur when our change in performance is at its lowest just because fatigue is so high. Then past that, say we're going more towards the end of the fitness curve, it'll be to where somebody's changed performance is starting to dip back down just because it's been so long so they've actually refined the skill to where that session might feel a bit more sluggish or just might feel awkward because they just don't have the skill refined as well. So that's where it gets to be that there's people on one of the spectrum like me to where I can only handle, 2 days a week. And if I try to do any more, whether it does come just from frequency or more volume or anything like that, to where I'll start getting more like tendinopathy in some sort of joints, or I'll start just feeling aches and pains, or I will start feeling too weak just from how much fatigue I am carrying that is masking how much fitness I have. But then there's people on the opposite end of that bell curve to where this happens for them over, say, a 24-hour period instead of a 72 to 96-hour period, to where they can handle 5-6 bench sessions a week, and they will actually start to feel sluggish if they go more than 48 hours without a bench session. And that is to say that there cannot be manipulations in either intensity or volume to make sure that we are able to get in more frequency. That certainly can be the case. But once again, that's something that we'll touch on next time whenever we start doing a bigger deep dive into what exactly is volume and what exactly is intensity. And that doesn't go to say that these things will always be figured out all the time. There will be times where things change externally, like say even like an athlete just getting stronger. Obviously that's a big hope that we all have. That will change the amount of load they can handle as well, and how much, even like the types of rep range, the amount of working sets, all that will continue to change as well as the athlete gets stronger. Or unfortunately, say if someone's get a little bit older, things will change as well. Or even, say somebody gets a new job, there's a lot more stress. Those external stressors even play a role into training fatigue as well. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up when it comes to discussing overall specificity and a little bit of fatigue and frequency. But guys, I'm an insanely open book. So if you have any questions for me based on any of this, please shoot me an email or even shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'll put all that in the description below. But next time we'll kind of go into a deeper dive on just volume and intensity and how those play into that fitness fatigue model as well, and helping determine the best amount of those as well.